In some ways, yes, he is just Dan with a knife.
Technically speaking, Dan was revealed to be a total sociopath.
Hello, Upper East Siders.
Joe would hate Dan because he would reflect him back to himself.
Every time he looked at his cell phone, receiving some blast from Gossip Girl, all those times, that was him acting.
Right.
When he was alone. So that means he was completely schizophrenic.
He's not an actual killer, even though he's a sociopath.
Means that the entire time.
Were you stalking them?
Yes, it was ruining the lives of those around me, including my little sister.
He outed his sister, losing her virginity. This is villainous.
You know you love me.
A large part of the internet is still convinced that Netflix's You is a dark sequel to Gossip Girl, and that Joe Goldberg is actually Dan Humphrey. Obviously, these two parallel worlds only initially connected because both characters are played by the same actor, our beloved, charming, and weird Penn Badgley. But the similarities go way deeper when you stop to analyze.
Guilty.
I gathered the best theories, similarities, clues, and coincidences on this topic to finally demystify whether it really makes sense for Joe to be Dan. Narrative logic, visual parallels, character traits, and even behind the scenes. To start, the revelation of who is behind Gossip Girl is done through a monologue by Dan, explaining his motivation and his plans from his point of view.
Teenagers acting like adults, adults acting like teenagers, guarding secrets, spreading gossip, all with the trappings of truly opulent wealth. If I wasn't born into this world, maybe I could write myself into it.
Doesn't seem like a big deal if you watch it from the perspective of someone from the Upper East Side. Colorful scenes, the laid-back surprise of side characters, and the upbeat music from the original show. But I made a small change in this final scene, using the same monologue from Dan. Now tell me if it reminds you of something, or someone specific.
Every writer needs his muse. And it wasn't until that photo of Serena in the white dress that I knew I had something strong enough to actually create a legend, launch a website. So I posted them anonymously. And then, when Serena came back from boarding school, I wrote my first post about me. Lonely boy, the outsider, the underdog.
In that revelation, Dan also mentions Fitzgerald,
The Upper East Side was like something from Fitzgerald or Thackeray.
a name that is also cited a few times by Joe. And it's no mystery that Dan is also extremely intelligent, articulate, loves books, and is even a writer. In fact, in the show, he writes a book entirely based on real facts, exposing the darkest secrets of everyone around him, including family. My man really exploited everyone to achieve his personal goals and success, basically betraying the trust of all those who shared something about their lives with Dan. And Joe is obsessed with books and works in a bookstore at the beginning of You, which is also in Brooklyn, where Dan lives. Yes, they live in the same place too. And is also a devoted writer. You can see this in moments like when Joe writes fantasies about being a literal killer in Season 5, where he wrote about killing the people he normally would. But since he was trying to stay sober from killing, instead of using a knife, he was using a pen. Also in his fictional romances with Bronte, and he had a drawer full of pages from these writings, both the romance and the murder. And clearly he wasn't an amateur, since even in the first season, Joe rewrote parts of Beck's book, who was actually a real writer, added new things, and obviously formatted it into book format to be published, and only one person suspected that someone else had touched the book besides the writer Beck, Bronte. So obviously he had a writer's gift, maybe just for being a literature geek, or maybe because of some expertise in making books.
I should have known it was you on the surveillance tape, Dinah, Sammy. You were the only one who wasn't there with us that night.
You're the only one who owns a hoodie.
The one I felt stupid about was graduation, when I asked Gossip Girl to meet me, and then Dan showed up.
Both also comment on the rich and the elite, about how powerful they are, something Joe also says in Season 2 of You with the Quinn family. In You, we see everything from Joe's perspective, hearing his thoughts, seeing unrealistic imaginary situations and things he's literally just imagining randomly, and even some rather suspicious imaginations. Speaking of perspective, in this latest season of You, many people talk about how he became extremely scary and frightening in the last 2 episodes abruptly, especially in the last one. And the answer is that from the last episode onward, we no longer see the series through Joe's perspective, in the way that everything he does seems justifiable and we are manipulated into siding with him, but rather from Bronte, the victim, seeing her thoughts, her point of view, her fear, and seeing him from the opposite side as a secondary character. And even not hearing the monologues inside his head anymore is scary because not knowing what he's thinking is agonizing, since he could be thinking anything, like in this scene. Bronte realizing that he found it strange to have avoided the kiss.
Shit, you felt that.
And so, since we know everything he is and does, it's automatically terrifying to see him from the victim's point of view instead of the predator. And Gossip Girl is relatively the series' perspective, where she starts and ends the episodes and changes the plot through her posts, literally manipulating. The difference is that Dan does this indirectly, using his alter ego as the mediator of these manipulations, both in his favor and against him, but aiming to get something out of it, mainly involving his relationship with Serena, basically turning the show into Dan's own point of view since he is Gossip Girl. Joe, on the other hand, does this directly. He explains what he's thinking and going to do and directly manipulates people. He uses the internet as a primary source of information, but then he does everything in a more manual way. He became obsessed with Serena the moment he saw her. The similarities with Beck's scenes are actually quite striking, especially knowing that Dan, being Gossip Girl, had Serena as his main target. Most of his posts were about her, both the light ones and those really heavy ones that affected her deeply. He stalked Serena before they had any relationship or closeness. He used the blog to promote his relationship with Serena, and Joe had his first stalker strategy using the internet, looking up everything about the girls, knowing where they went, their friends, and especially their tastes and dreams, which was basically a way for him to share the same interests and become much more attractive to women since they had so much in common, and consequently making them more susceptible to falling for him. The worrying part about Dan was that he posted atrocities about Serena, things that made her see herself from the outside, even turning intimate moments between them into a breakdown for her, like in that scene where she says, "Well, no one's ever looked at me this way. In fact, I don't think they ever looked at me at all." Clearly sensitive.
It's just nobody's ever looked at me the way you just did. In fact, I don't think they looked at me at all.
And Dan seems like a white knight in shining armor, comforting her, seeming like the only one who understands her and that he would never hurt her. But in reality, through his posts, Dan seriously damaged Serena's reputation, which obviously affected her psychologically. When you look at it from this angle, the absurd toxicity and manipulation from Dan to make Serena love him becomes visible. Manipulation, by the way, that he also uses with Beck in several moments. And something even creepier about Dan is that he used the blog to stalk Serena even before they had a relationship, also during their dating, and especially after the breakup, when he kept stalking her. Season 4 of You is basically Gossip Girl. Joe ends up in the middle of socialites, his love interest is surrounded by that, but then everything goes wrong. Joe starts hallucinating an alter ego, Reese, and someone even tweeted, if Gossip was just Dan's dissociative personality like Reese is for Joe, it'd all make sense. And it doesn't matter where Joe Dan is, NYC, LA, London, he always ends up among the elite, even being an outsider, the lonely boy, infiltrating the elite through self-promotion in his secret blog, and Joe infiltrating the bourgeoisie of his girlfriend's social circles. Not to mention the persecution of wealthy people that he seems to hate, just like in the first season of Gossip Girl, and also in season 4 of You. One of the biggest flaws in this theory, as you must be wondering, is, so how is the different childhood of both explained? It would be impossible. Well, that one is a bit harder, but the most acceptable explanation would be that Joe Goldberg is his original identity, and that Dan Humphrey is the identity he chose during Gossip Girl. Oh, and a suspicious curiosity is that even in the names there's a similarity. Joe Goldberg and Dan Humphrey have the exact same number of letters, a 3-letter first name and an 8-letter surname. Joe has an established childhood in You, but not much about his teenage years. We know that after everything that happened with his parents, Joe went to an orphanage. And what if he was adopted by the Humphreys? That would explain him having sociopathic and manipulative tendencies during Gossip Girl, and eventually, after the events and drama that happened during the show, and after its end, where he marries Serena. That's what really turned him into the psychopath from You. So what happened to his life in the Upper East Side? The main cycle, and especially, what happened to Serena van der Woodsen? At the end of Gossip Girl, Dan marries Serena in a fairy tale ending, which is, in many people's view, something unrealistic, considering that Serena would never stay with Dan knowing he was behind her biggest stalker, who harmed her so much and always lied. But let's say she accepted anyway. The main theory is that the two went through a bitter divorce, for reasons ranging from the main factor always mentioned by both about how they didn't belong to the same world and were very different, to Serena realizing she was married to a sociopath who forced his way into her world by destroying several things through his blog, or even the darkest one, that Serena had cheated on Dan, and obviously he would find out. And it wouldn't be hard to believe that knowing Serena, because if you don't remember, in an act of revenge against Blair, she manipulated Nate into sleeping with her, and to do that she got drunk with him and recorded a sex tape without Nate's consent. She wasn't so saint after all. Since the whole Upper East Side and Gossip Girl cycle revolves around the elite, and has Serena as the protagonist of this world and anchor, it's acceptable to say that everyone sided with Serena after the divorce, and consequently cut Dan out of their lives, since basically all the contact he had with the rest of the characters was only possible due to his relationship with Serena. And this was when he started to get lost, reverted to his original name, Joe, after the divorce. It's not hard to imagine that Joe Dan would change identities, since Joe does this twice, adopting the names Will Bettelheim and Jonathan Moore to hide his past identity and start from scratch. He left his home with Serena because obviously he didn't live with Rufus and Jenny after the wedding, and Serena was the rich one in the relationship, so the property would be hers. One of Joe's traumas is the abandonment by his own mother, whom he did everything to protect. He associated violence with love, didn't interpret violence as something bad if he judged it necessary to protect those he loved. After the divorce filed by Serena, he may have seen it as another abandonment by a blonde woman he loved so much and did everything for, and this only fueled even more the toxic and problematic personality of Joe, even more traumatized with issues of abandonment or possibly betrayal, and this will be important in the future. So he moved on, considering he really accepted the divorce and didn't kill Serena, obviously, but we'll follow the other timeline. The next romantic interest was then Candace, and hear me out. Before Serena, Dan had a fling with Blair, which was kind of weird to be honest. I'll come back to that soon. Back to it. Candace was the first post-Serena, and she has a very sassy and bitchy and cocky vibe, and also a hair tone with reddish highlights. Kinda looks like someone. Maybe Joe just wanted to relive the Blair era and ended up finding someone with similar traits as his rebound from Serena, like a kind of emotional revenge against her by getting with someone like Blair, who was Serena's closest person. It's kind of far-fetched, I know, but go with the script. Get it? The script. Sorry, back to it. Joe ends up discovering that Candace had a hidden affair where she deliberately cheated on Joe, and he got paranoid stalking her and digging through her privacy, and actually following her one day and seeing that he was really being cheated on, he confronted her lover, had a rage outburst, and finally committed his first murder. If you consider that the reason for the divorce with Serena was due to her cheating, it's easy to accept that Joe lost it the moment it happened again. And that's why he decided to commit that murder, because he didn't want to accept that it had happened to him again. After that, he decides to work at the bookstore and begins the U series as we know it. And then he meets her, Guinevere Beck, the skinny blonde hot girl that many call Joe's new Serena. In both pilots, the series opens with Penn's characters fixated on their romantic interest, in a tone of admiration and intrigue, watching from afar. The difference is that with Serena, he didn't approach to use his psycho charm, which at the time probably wasn't as effective as it would become in his later obsessions. And honestly, that hair didn't help either. What the hell is this hair? With Beck, though, he instantly engages and starts with the creepy behavior we know, doing a scan of deductions based solely on his own opinion, becoming obsessed with his new blonde who's more low profile than Serena was. Dan's passion was always Serena, his main target, so it's understandable to think that after his rebound with Candace, possibly mentally channeling Blair, he would go back to his factory settings, where Beck is equal to Serena. There are similar stereotypes in both series. The lonely boys obsessed with the it girls, both fixate on wealthy blonde women as their idealized love. Even Love Quinn is a wealthy girl. His first line in You is upon seeing Beck.
Well, hello there.
And the first line of Gossip Girl, in Dan's case, is also with Serena showing up right after Dan's
Hey Upper East Siders, Gossip Girl here.
Serena is to Dan what Beck is to Joe, but now he has a second chance, and this would explain him being completely paranoid about everything related to them, especially about the friends circle, possible betrayals and ex-boyfriends, but mainly about Beck's bourgeois friends. It even feels like he's had past experiences with his girlfriend's rich friends. He also has this sense of devotion for his beloved, as if he were truly a knight who would do absurd things for his loved one. But despite being a monster, Joe always seemed to show affection and empathy for the kids in the series, like Paco in the first season, Ellie in the second, and his own son. This could be related to his protective instinct involving Jenny, whom Dan always seemed to care for. Obviously for that, you'd have to forget that he exposed his own sister Jenny on the blog, something even the actor is baffled by when talking about it.
He outed his sister, losing her virginity. These storylines are twisted.
However, at the end of the series, it's said that Jenny herself asked him to post it so that she'd be trending, and it worked, so I guess it's all good. Dan is also kind of aggressive about that since he punched Chuck in the mouth twice. Obviously, there will be plot holes in this theory, but come on! Even Dan being Gossip Girl is full of plot holes, so why not use our imagination? One fact is, if you finish You and rewatch Gossip Girl with the theory that they're the same character, you'll see Dan as a complete sociopath through his actions, and will have a very different perception of his relationship with Serena. Though I must confess, it was really interesting to rewatch the series with the perspective that everything was orchestrated by the person we now know as Joe Goldberg. I recommend you do that and see how the show feels very different when viewed from the angle that he's been a sociopath from the beginning. If you like this video, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for future videos. It'll mean a lot to me. And if you don't do that, Joe will be running like this to your house today to have a word. XOXO, Gossip Girl. Or should we say, you.